who have these markings on their rear, which look like large eyes. And you'll actually see examples of this among many insects, large sort of eye-like structures, which have sort of which have come up in the space of mutations in genes that that sort of emerge among caterpillars. But plausibly, our understanding of evolution is that something like this might be selected for if it effectively makes a tiny caterpillar look like a large snake. And so these are examples of forms of communication that that may serve the opposite function as this. This is an attractive signal, and this would be a repulsive signal. But the reason I like starting with these two examples is that because we're so used to thinking of human communication, we often think of communication as being something extremely intentional. We understand human perception and human intention largely through, in fact, communicating with each other. We're not always able to segregate what we think of as intentional action versus unintentional action in non-humans, simply because we can't ask what a non-human and get easy answers in languages that we share with non-humans about what they might be experiencing or perceiving or intending at the time that a signal goes off. And so the main purpose of this slide is that insect communication sheds a really, really nice light on the evolution of communication systems. And that's a key question that I'm interested in as well. And in many of these cases, we see forms and shapes and things like that that are not under intentional control that still may show advantages of the kind that can lead to natural selection. Whether attractive in this case, because this helps, these kinds of attractions of insects towards plants can help with plant pollination, and in this case, natural selection, because this functions as a source of protection for this caterpillar. I mean, you can even see that sometimes the the markings may also be much more complicated, and in this case, it really looks, even shape-wise, like the head of a viper, right? So it's just a really cool system to study. We do know of examples of intentional deception. For example, this is a drongo, and I had a former colleague named Samira who studies intentional deception among these animals. Very cool system. And we know these animals will sometimes produce calls that can mimic the calls of predators to kind of scare off the competition in mixed species flocks. But for the rest of this talk, I'll be dealing with insects where we we assume that this is intentional because these calls are deployed in very specific contexts. But again, the question of whether it is intentional or not is something that we will not get into, despite the fact that that's what deception sort of implies. And there's a lot of these two kinds of communication can arguably be thought of as forms of deception as well. Well, there's visual, communication between animals to convey information. One of the most complex examples of this is what we see among bees that signal the location of food in a hive. Some of you may have heard of this, the sort of famous waggle dance of bees, where they go round in a circle. I'm not sure you can see my cursor in this mode, so I'll move to the slide display mode, since that's slightly better with respect to showing you my cursor. So, these will sort of move in the semicircular kind of form, and then break through the center of the circle, waggling their behinds, then go on the other side of the semicircle, break through, and so on. And the waggle dance has been observed at beehives multiple times. But what was interesting is that it was the observation that bees will do this, and as they do this, other bees will join them and waggle behind them, join them and waggle behind them. And then the lead bee will take off in the direction in which it waggled. And it turns out that when they continue in the direction in which they waggled, with the sun as a landmark, right? If they continue to fly, keeping the sun in the same position on the retina where it was when they were on the nest, then if they keep flying in that direction, they bump into food. Likewise, whatever the direction that they move in, it looks like, suppose it's at a 60-degree angle to the sun. If they continue flying with the sun at that same 60-degree angle, they again bump into food. So this is an incredibly informative and complex form of communication, much more so than what we've seen earlier. And of course, see other forms of visual communication, where our university is located in Rajasthan, um, by these brownish, yellowish, yellow and black forms of locusts. These same locusts can exist in this green form, and in that form they live solitary and isolated lives. But when they start to get crowded, a combination of mechanosensory, like rubbing up against each other, just being physically crowded, and that seems to start causing a visual change in their coloration, and that further in turn seems to spur the animals as a group who change color, and this runaway process of signaling also changes the behavior of these animals from being solitary animals to seeking the company of other gregarious morphs, and then they fly off together in very, very large numbers and can devastate agricultural fields in their wake by just sort of eating everything in sight. As I said, many flowers also show incredible, beauty, and in terms of attracting insects. They're not always, deceptively sort of mimicking, female insects. But this is just to say that remember that many insects have better, have ultraviolet vision. Vision in something is called ultraviolet when it is beyond the range of human perception. But some of the flowers that you see bees attracted to may actually have more complex patterns under UV light than we even see under visible light. Okay, so we looked at food, at safety, and at at pollination as being reasons for which these forms of visual communication take place. But what about other forms of communication? What about other types of communication? I work largely on vibratory and acoustic communication among insects. So before we get to that, let's look at a couple of other forms of communication. Olfaction or smell is actually really, really important to these animals. And as a behavioral biologist who's largely interested in hearing, I actually have to spend a fair amount of time while designing experiments to make sure that that these animals are not kind of smelling their way to each other instead of moving towards sources of sound. So controlling for smell is always complex, but you can see that with all of these animals, there's just really elaborate antennae. These are moths for sensing, input, for sensing, smell input, and the crickets and bush crickets that I work with also have very, very large antennae. So smell is a really important mode of communication. These are often used to smell each other and to detect each other, but also to detect food and occasionally predators. In the case of female mosquitoes, you already know and are probably experiencing, even as I speak, female mosquitoes who are able to smell their way towards sources of human blood, such as yourself. And this is a mosquito sort of getting engorged on somebody's blood. There's also some really, really nice work that's been done on the mosquito system. Work, for example, looking at how mosquitoes are not just interested in and attracted to heat and carbon dioxide and so on, but also to specific odorants that are found in human sweat, and the evolution of mosquito responses to not just mammalian sweat, but human sweat in particular, sort of parallel and interesting trend in the preponderance that is just a the number of humans as compared to other mammalian forms that that exist on the planet. You've also heard mosquitoes at night making that annoying soing, sort of buzzing noise, right, as they hover around your face. I don't know if it makes you feel better to know that the wing beat, which is what generates that noise, right, just the rate at which mosquitoes are flapping their wings, this also constitutes a love song and can also act as an attractive auditory signal between mosquitoes. So if it makes you feel better to know that mosquitoes that are annoying you with that sound are not fundamentally trying to annoy you, but are trying to attract each other, this may ease your irritation at them somewhat. On the other hand, it might irritate you more, right? You might say, why do I have to be subjected to these love songs? Okay, as I said, I work a little bit on vibratory communication and mostly on acoustic communication. Acoustic just means with respect to sound. Here are some examples of animals that use vibratory communication. You will have seen some of these animals. In fact, sometimes they really get attracted to light in large numbers, and people sometimes call them machars, right? But these are leaf hoppers, plant hoppers, stoneflies, and spiders. And these are all actually animals that use, and spiders, of course, aren't insects, but all of these use vibratory communication for signaling. In fact, with spiders, some of this can be quite, quite dire. In that, here you see a male spider approaching a female. Among arachnids, and actually among a lot of insects as well, arachnids are spiders. Females are usually larger than males. This is also true of the insect species I work on, simply because we're so used to thinking of maleness and femaleness as in these very human categories, where the average height of one of the two modes of biological sex, men, is on average larger than those of women. But in the natural world, really the only universal definition of maleness is having smaller gametes or sex cells than females who have larger gametes. And so at the size scale of insects and some of these spiders, the fact that the female is defined by having larger sex cells, just larger gametes, females are just larger than males. So this is the large one here is a female, the small one's a male. And when he approaches her to mate, if his vibratory communication skills are not good, specifically, he has to approach her web. And if an animal blunders into her web, that animal is food. And she will gladly eat him if he does not pluck on the strings of her web and essentially play like a stringed instrument, her web, in a way that conveys to her that he's not food, but a suitor. So if not careful about approaching his date the right way, he may become dinner, which somewhat changes the meaning or the interpretation of the term dinner in a date. He has to decide between, he has to play the web right so that he becomes the date and not the dinner. In fact, when he reaches her, he'll then have to drum upon her back as well. And it's a combination of these courtship skills that gets him a chance to be the date and not to be dinner. And those of you who know of mantises know that that mantis females can be even more brutal when they are being approached. In fact, with mantises, the male almost always becomes dinner and the date simultaneously. In fact, female mantises will start eating the heads of males who approach them to mate while they are mating. So I'm not showing you a video of that right now because of lack of time, but I'll try and move ahead to showing you what some of my research is about. So I work on insects that communicate through sound. A large number of acoustically communicating insects are in the group Orthoptera. And Orthoptera basically means crickets, bush crickets, locusts, grasshoppers. And grasshoppers and locusts are one group, and crickets and bush crickets are another subgroup within Orthoptera. Now, you've heard these animals. So anytime you're out at night in a somewhat kind of, not necessarily heavily forested, but just some place where there's a decent amount of plant cover, you will have heard these animals chirping at night, right? Krr, 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 right? Crickets chirping at night. These grasshoppers and locusts largely call during the day. But this is an interesting group because we see seemingly multiple origins of communication behavior. And so it's a nice system in which to understand the evolution of communication, which, as I told you, is one of my interests. So what are some of the differences between or similarities between these groups? As I've said, grasshoppers and locusts have not just it seems a different sort of origin of both sound production and hearing, which is sound reception, but also very different organs that produce both. For example, the ear of a grasshopper is on its tummy, on its abdomen, whereas the ears of crickets and bush crickets are on their front legs. Okay, so neither of them have ears on the sides of their heads, like we do. And the other very easy way by which to tell whether you're dealing with a grasshopper or a cricket is that grasshoppers have these short, stubby antennae, which are about the size of the face, whereas crickets and bush crickets, who historically used to be called long-horned grasshoppers, you can see where they get that name because they have these very, very long antennae, probably useful for and those long antennae can actually be as long as the size of the body. Okay, and as you can see, they have both sound hearing structures, ears, in different parts of their body, which seem to have independently evolved from different mechanosensory organs, and they produce sound somewhat differently. So I'm just going to show you a video of how they produce sound so that you can see the difference for yourself instead of my telling you. So here you can watch a grasshopper produce sound. I hope you saw that. So if you could see it carefully, this involved a grasshopper rubbing its hind legs on right, so rubbing its hind legs against against each other and against the abdomen. It's a very different mode of sound production than what we see in crickets, which is the group that I study, which, as you remember, have these long antennae and ears on their forelimbs. So hopefully you can see this, and I'm just going to play it for long enough so that you can actually witness that this song, which is a song advertising the position of the male towards females, you can actually see the female approach the male as he's making this sound. But as you can see, the way the sound is made is by the rubbing of the wings against each other, and here's the female who's found the male. Okay, so very different ways of producing sound in the case of crickets and bush crickets through rubbing the wings together, in the case of grasshoppers and locusts through rubbing the legs. Okay, I've written crickets and bush crickets among the group crickets because these are two subsets of the group of crickets. Many crickets don't produce or hear sounds, but ground crickets, which is what you saw earlier, produce sound slightly differently. Both groups use their wings, but this is a bush cricket living in a tree, yeah, you can see how it produces sound, and you can it's hard to sort of spot the difference, but essentially in both cases, parts of the wing are rubbing against each other. And this is just a lovely photo showing you that there is a row of teeth on one wing that gets plucked by a plucker on another wing, and that then gets amplified on the other wing. So the whole wing then moves as a sort of as a whole, as a whole sort of eardrum-like structure after being struck by the other wing. Okay, there was a nice clip that I would show you if we had a little more time about crickets, but I'll skip ahead to just showing you that in the cricket tree, you see multiple origins. The shaded arms indicate multiple origins. I'm just gonna exit full screen so I can show you with my cursor where it is that you see multiple origins of sound production and sound reception among crickets. Okay, so one question that one has is whether call identity defines species identity. So then you have nice work of the kind done by Jaiswara et al. 2012, where they looked at call divergence across of one species named Iteropsis across different parts of the country, and actually found different call types. Likewise, we actually work on a really nice system called Mycopoda, where you can see and this was work done by Nityananda and Rohini Balakrishnan's lab, looking at and demonstrating the ways in which a single morph of an animal called Mycopoda produces very, very different calls in different contexts. So let me play that for you. This is a call that most of you will have heard in India because it's a common bush cricket that you'll hear in Delhi, in Bangalore, in Hyderabad, in all of the cities where I've lived, not just in more, right? These are two different, time periods from different morphs of this chirper, right? Which is just essentially an animal that produces regular chirps. But you sometimes, there are certain parts of the Western Ghats where Vivek Nityanand actually found multiple morphs that had more complicated songs. For example, this sound, which is a more complex sound that seems to have evolved, in a particular morph of this animal called Mycopoda. So we're interested in the evolution of song and how this complex structure that you're hearing now evolved from the simpler chirp structure that you're still hearing in the background. So of course, this system throws up very interesting questions such as, are these cryptic species that are caught in the midst of forming separate speciation? How pakka are they? Is there separation from one another? When you see new types of call emerge, how are these different new types of call recognized, and so on? A third kind of problem that we deal with when it comes to insect communication is what's called the cocktail party problem. Now, the cocktail party problem is one that is defined in sort of a context where there are cocktail parties. But for I've never been to a cocktail party, so if you haven't either, no worries. In India, we encounter the cocktail party problem in all of our crowded public spaces, the metro, the bus, anywhere, where if lots and lots of people are talking to one another, sometimes it's so loud that you can barely keep track of what the person in front of you is saying, and often you're lip reading them in order to assist your own ability to hear them. So the cocktail party problem applies not just to humans but also to insects, which is, for humans, the problem is how do you have 20 people talking at the same time. All of these sounds fall on one tympanum, your eardrum, which vibrates and then sends information to your ear. So how are individual speakers segregated from one another when all of their sounds come together to vibrate your eardrum? This is not a problem with a trivial solution, and we try and find a simpler system than humans to answer this in. In crickets, for example, their equivalent of the cocktail party problem is the tropical jungle problem, which is that if you're listening to crickets in a relatively not so biodiverse space, a city, a backyard, then you may only hear a few crickets calling at a time. But if you are in a tropical jungle, the use of acoustic space is much more contested, and you'll actually have multiple animals calling at the same time, multiple, in Kudremukh National Park, for example, where Rohini Balakrishnan has worked for several, I would say, decades by now. They have a really, really nice, clean understanding of all of the acoustic callers in a forest, and they have a full understanding of all of the ecological pressures at work on these crickets, including the pressures of sharing an acoustic space. So all of the calling animals, their song properties called loudness, called transmission, and so on is beautifully quantified by the lab with respect to this field area. And that then sets us up with the perfect system in which to look at questions of how hearing happens and how auditory processing happens in these insects' nervous systems. So a call like this, for example, a caller like this will face a cocktail party problem, specifically in terms of this sort of simple call and being masked by a broadband, overlapping call by this animal, Mycopoda, whom I've introduced you to before. So this second call almost entirely masks the first. You yourself can't hear the first call, even though it is playing in the background simultaneously with this other call. I've worked largely on a particular animal that has evolved a beautiful alternative to these various calls in the forest called Whistler. And if I play you the song, you'll see why we call this animal Whistler. It's a beautiful animal. It looks like, and this photo was taken by Natasha Matre. It's just an absolutely gorgeous animal, and it's what's called a pseudophily, right? Its wings look like fake leaves, but the venation on the wing is just absolutely spectacular, and it looks exactly like the jackfruit trees on which these animals live, sit, eat, poop, mate, and die. And so this animal mimics the tree that it sits on to such an incredible extent that it's quite hard to find them when you're searching for them, when you're doing a visual search for these insects. But as you've heard from the song, it produces this beautiful whistling call, which is why it was called Whistler. And these are animals that like other bush crickets come from a family of bush crickets which largely produce noisy broadband calls of the kind that I showed you earlier with that animal Mycopoda, right? Crack, 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 right? That is the genre of calls that's produced by other bush crickets, and yet this is a bush cricket which sounds like a cricket. It's producing beautiful, pure tone, narrow band calls. And the question that we ask is, we ask multiple questions. One is, this is a potential solution that has been stumbled on in mutational space that solves, quote unquote, the cocktail party problem, because the call is at such a low frequency that it's effectively avoiding acoustic competition with other broadband callers, right? In the midst of the cocktail party, this is the equivalent of somebody's voice who's instantly recognizable because it's either very high pitched, unlike everybody else's, or very low pitched, unlike everybody else's. In this case, this is a low pitched call for a cricket. Okay, but every solution in ecological space also produces new problems. So we're interested, for example, in what some of those problems are in audition and how they can be overcome. For this animal, for example, the fact that it's producing such a low frequency call then poses multiple problems. Of course, one problem that we're always interested in is how do the females recognize a call when you have a family or a group, a subset of insects which are producing very different calls from sort of the ancestral call type that they originated from. So how does call recognition and call production, how do these evolve together? These are two different systems. One involves the wings being rubbed against each other, and the other involves sounds being heard and recognized. So we're very interested in how these two systems co-evolve. But the other problem that this animal faces is that it's very difficult to assess the direction of incoming sound when the wavelength of a song. So at 2.3 kilohertz, 3.2 kilohertz, the wavelength of the song is 10.6 centimeters. And the way that you tell where sounds are coming from is that sounds are coming from the right side of your head. They'll either be louder at your right ear than your left, or they will arrive slightly earlier to right ear than your left. And so this is actually a problem that involves difficult and intricate computation between the patterns of vibrations upon your two eardrums to see whether a similar sound has reached both ears, but with some time lag. And then if there is a time lag or a loudness difference between the two ears, then the direction of the incoming call is assessed based on comparing input from these two ears. But if even though these animals have ears on their forelegs, you can see the ears here. Actually, that's a close-up of the ear that you're seeing over there. In fact, these are really cool animals. They have two eardrums per ear. But the distance between their two legs with the two ears is about 2 to 3 centimeters. And it's just too small a distance between those two ears for meaningful differences in sound loudness or sound phase to sort of provide information to this animal as to where the source of the incoming call is. So we're very interested in how these animals are able to infer direction at such low frequency calls. And so, the question also is, of course, how are such low frequency sounds produced? Typically, mice squeak and elephants rumble. So for low frequency calls, low pitch sounds, typically you need larger structures. So we're of course also interested in how insects produce such low frequency sounds despite having very small, bodies. As typically to get a good bass going, you need a large speaker, and you don't get this kind of amplification from small headphones. So manufacturers of headphones are also very interested in how you can make small structures produce lower frequency bass notes. Okay, so this is a CT scan that we took of this animal's ear. You can kind of see indicated by the white arrows the two eardrums that go from the central stem to the back of the ear. And we did a bunch of nice work looking also at what's called the tracheal system, which is an air-filled tube behind the ear that opens into the side of the body. Because this then allows crickets and bush crickets this very, very interesting chance to not just hear sounds coming on to, so our eardrums are closed, right? That is to say, on one end, there's one end open to the outside world on which sounds fall, that at the other end it's closed, whereas these animals have an air-filled tube behind the other end of the tympanum as well, opening up into the side of the body. And so if a sound is in front of them, it will fall directly on the ear, but if it's off to the side, it may actually fall on the back of the eardrum at higher intensities than the front, providing directional information potentially even within a single ear. So this is part of how we and crickets actually have their trachea from both sides of the body meeting in the center, meaning that a sound behind the body will actually or at an angle will actually affect both eardrums differently depending on where it's placed. In our case, we also took our whistler and looked at how the eardrum vibrates to see what these eardrums were responding to, and we did this using what's called a Doppler vibrometer, that is a laser which looks at the frequencies of the laser that are emitted back to get a sense of whether the object that they're falling on, in this case the animal's tympanal membrane, whether it's moving towards the laser or away from the laser. So if you place the laser perpendicular to a to a source of to say the eardrum, you can actually watch the eardrum move in terms of how it Doppler shifts the frequencies coming back. And this is the same Doppler effect that you'll remember from school or from a train station, where as a train approaches you, it looks like the wavelength is reducing, that is, the frequency is going up, whereas when it moves away from you, you have the opposite effect. So we actually see that Whistler has very, very interesting ears, and we're interested in the ears to understand how the animal's perception of sound has shifted now that it is in the context of it producing very low frequency calls. And we actually find that one eardrum per year is just listening to low frequency calls. So in this graph, you have, I'm going to exit again so that you can see. On this graph, you have frequency in this on the x-axis and displacement of the eardrum on the y-axis. And you can see that the ear shows a lot of activity for low frequencies, but it's responsiveness drops off very sharply at higher frequencies. And in fact, if you look at the exact point in frequency space where it drops off so that it effectively is not listening to any of the other species calling in the forest. So these are the frequencies of other species in the forest. And this is a really sharp low pass filter. That is, it lets through low frequencies, but it's interesting. It's like having a ear that just listens to your own species and doesn't listen to everybody else. So this is another example of a solution that's been found in evolutionary space to the cocktail party problem. Of course, you can argue that it's not a good idea to only be listening to each other's love song and to just not listen to any of the other calls being made in the forest. So it looks like because these animals have two eardrums per year. In fact, in many crickets, one eardrum functions and the other one seems to be a dud. It doesn't respond to sound. But in these animals, they have this beautiful differential tuning of the two eardrums, where one eardrum is only listening to low frequency sounds. That is to say, in this forest context, only the call of the lover, of the conspecific mate, potential mate, and it's sort of really filtering out all other songs. Whereas the other tympanal membrane on the same ear listens to, has multiple sensitivities and peaks to higher frequencies as well. So we do work of this kind to understand, we've understood how co-evolution of male calling and female hearing might take place. We find matched filters between the ear of the animal and its, and the call, and some really cool novel stuff about frequencies being partitioned between the two tympanal membranes. And we're also interested in behavioral and neural work. And I'll try and skip ahead soon to the neural work, just that we, just because I'm really interested in having students who might be interested in working on some of those aspects of the system. So our behavioral work, I'll just leave you with a quick video showing you what this animal's behavior is like. Whoops. I think that for some reason, all right, this works. All right, for some reason the video is not showing, which is probably just as well because I'm slightly low on time. But I will tell you that when we did behavioral work trying to see how this animal responded to, to conspecific calls, we found that these animals actually, show this sort of wobbling behavior in response to chirps of the song. So if you remember the chirps of the song, they go doo-doo-doo, 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 and in alternation, you find these animals sort of violently shaking in response to the song. And our same laser Doppler vibrometer could be used to quantify the vibrational sort of signal that these animals produce. And in fact, these animals will, not only do they produce vibrational signals, but this is then a very novel multimodal duet in which we find that these animals are able to, the males produce these acoustic calls, the females produce a different mode of response, a vibrational response. And not only are we able to record this vibrational response, but we're able to play the vibrational response to other males, and we can actually watch those males respond to either a live female's kind of tremulation or a played back, like a synthesized tremulation.
Can you please share your screen once more?
Oh, I see, has screen sharing stopped. Sorry about that. There you go. Hoping you can see my screen.
Yes.
This just happened, right? Because I noticed that for some reason the screen sharing stopped. Okay, so I'll just show you the animal and the slides very quickly. These are alternations of the male's acoustic call and the female's vibratory response. And since they can do this for a while, this is a multimodal duet, quite unusual in the animal world to find one of these. In fact, at the time that we published this, we knew of no others, and one was published around the same time as ours of another cricket system where we saw a multimodal duet, where the author saw a multimodal duet. And these are multimodal in the sense that, the males producing an acoustic call, the females producing a vibratory response, they can both localize and move towards each other's calls. but they can continue this for a while in the process of localizing each other. Okay, so there's a lot of lots of interesting material here on on how tremulation and this kind of behavior might have evolved in the context of predatory bats, eavesdropping upon this system. And so, I'm not going to go into a lot more detail on this right now, but I'll just quickly tell you what some of our future directions on these kinds of projects are. One is that we're now looking at the neural basis of recognizing and responding to these calls, and we're specifically interested in finding students who'd be willing to and who are interested in looking at this question. And I should also just tell you that we have a few other directions that we're also going in with respect to multiple song types. For example, in a system in the system that I showed you earlier called Mycopoda, in which you have the evolution of multiple song types. We're interested in looking at those multiple song types. And finally, I should just quickly do my acknowledgements and acknowledge the students in my lab, my postdoc lab where I first started working on this problem, and my sources of funding, the DST, CRG sort of grant, the DST INSPIRE grant, the DS Kothari fellowships, Sudhakar, who bought the first whistlers that we used for this work, yeah, so and Ashoka University, where I work now, has an annual research grant that's incredibly flexible and that enables me to do a lot of this this work. All right, thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Bittu, for this very intriguing talk, and it makes us wonder, like, there is so much to discover out there.
Absolutely, lots to be discovered.
Yeah. So far we don't have any questions. Yeah, I was thinking about a question which is sort of a bit more general.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about. I have heard that dolphins and whales, they have specific kinds of languages among themselves, or they sort of have something called songs. People call it as songs. Mm-hmm. And comparing to crickets and grasshoppers, which have sort of a more less complex mode of communication, these mammals will have a more complicated sort of paradigm for their communication. So, do you think that we can use sort of machine learning and stuff to record their behavior as well as their sounds, and try to find a correlation between them, that what kind of behavior leads to what kind of sound, yeah, and try to decode their language in a way?
Yeah, very, very good question. Yes, in fact, this approach, the machine learning approach, has been used with great success, with respect to bat song. So a very, very nice paper. I think, I don't know whether, I think from Uldanovsky's lab, from Yossi Yovel, I think these labs had worked on this question of bat song. And they used a very nice machine learning approach to find correlations between auditory and visual signaling from bat roosts, to get a sense of where the auditory signal was detected, what was the corresponding behavior that seemed to tell us what the meaning of the song is, right? With crickets, we have a very simple system. They produce these calls regardless of whether they're not learned behaviors. They seem to be default behaviors, and they'll initiate the song regardless of whether another animal is even present around them. They don't learn the song. But with a lot of animals that show vocal learning, from birds to, we think, dolphins and mammals, other mammalian systems that communicate acoustically, we don't know what they're saying, but they're clearly saying something to each other, and it could be something very simple, such as "I'm here," or it could be more complex. And certainly, whales and dogs, have a repertoire of songs, and not just a small number of sort of motifs in song. So it's entirely plausible and probable that there's meaning that we're not inferring because of the limitations of classical approaches. And I do think English has a really important role to play in starting to make sense of the, and that's what we do in our lab, right? Is we try and figure out what each meaning of each syllable of song might mean. How does recognition happen? How much of a song is required for recognition to be considered, to sort of be accomplished by the listener, and so on.
Okay. Okay, yeah, it was really interesting to go through your talk. So far we don't have any more questions. So maybe I thank Dr. Bittu once more for
Thank
this
you.
beautiful talk, and yeah.
Wonderful.
So here
Thank you.
we close the session here.
Sure.
Okay. Good night.